My name is Samantha, and I am the PIT coordinator at the Innocent Lives Foundation. Before I go a bit more into what I do at the ILF and what the ILF does, I wanted to just introduce you to what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to spend the next little bit talking about something that I like to call impetuous investigations, otherwise known as impulsive investigations. The ultimate goal of this presentation is for you to walk out of this with a basic understanding of how cognitive psychology, and especially biases, affect our decision-making and ultimately our OSINT investigations. My primary role at the ILF is to oversee the success of our PIT, the Predator Identification Team. That is our team of volunteers, investigators that help us unmask online child predators. We are a non-vigilante, non-profit, private predator hunting organization. So we actually seek out anyone who is requesting or trading child sexual abuse material that's thinking that they can hide behind anonymity online. In addition to that, I also teach OSINT to law enforcement officials with heavy focus on understanding predatory behavior, as well as terminology and their digital footprint. If I'm not teaching OSINT specific, I'm also teaching dark web research and tactics. Again, specifically related to internet crimes against children. When I'm not with the ILF, I hold a position on the board of directors at the Idaho Internet Crimes Against Children's Coalition. So as we go into this presentation, one of the key factors throughout the entire thing is something that's called metacognition. And stopping to think about how we think helps us work towards actionable intelligence. Metacognition is just that. It's intentional thinking about how you can think and how you learn. Some observations you can make to yourself about yourself is, I'm seeing, I'm feeling, I'm thinking, I'm noticing, now I'm wondering. So what does psychology have to do with open source intelligence? Well, behavior and overall cognitive psychology teaches us about the blind spots that our biases can cause. Having blind spots in this line of work and in overall decision-making can lead us to improper conclusions. You definitely cannot stop yourself from having biases, but you can stop yourself to think about how they may be affecting your investigation and how they may be persuading your overall decision-making. This is exactly where metacognition comes into play. Really stop and think about how you are thinking and how is it affecting your current decisions. There is an entire sea of biases out there, as well as much more educated books on cognitive psychology, but these were the ones that I found very interesting that I could squeeze into the small amount of time that we have together today. So we are going to be discussing confirmation bias, anchoring bias, automation bias, projection bias, overconfidence bias, and then last but not least, the halo effect / reverse halo effect. So let's start by discussing confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you're favoring information that supports your current preconceptions of something while you disregard opposing evidence that you might find. You're ultimately ignoring objective facts and evidence and seeking out things that evidence that supports your current personal beliefs. I'm sure you see news outlets playing to confirmation bias all the time, and that's why you see various information that is correct to their perspective and not the others. So how does confirmation bias impact our OSINT investigations? Well, confirmation bias can cause us to provide incorrect data. Incorrect data leads us to improper conclusions. Improper conclusions can lead to damaged lives, whether it's your own or someone else's. Someone may be terminated from employment, they may be improperly convicted, or they or you may suffer overall reputational damage. So again, you cannot force yourself to absolutely get rid of this, but you can stop and ask yourself, does my evidence only support my theory? Have I considered opposing theories? And have I sought out those opposing theories? And have my searches been specifically seeking validating information? Next is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias sounds in concept similar to confirmation bias, but it's different in the effect that you're actually anchoring onto a single piece of information and allowing that to overshadow any new information. Where confirmation bias is when you are actually actively seeking out information that validates your current perspective. Anchoring bias is also known as the focalism effect. It causes us to get tunnel vision on a single piece of information, anchoring us into that persistent state of thought. And usually it's the piece of data that we receive very early on. Okay, how does anchoring bias affect our investigations? Well, when we get tunnel vision on single pieces of information, we lose our ability to see any new data or pivot points. So document that anchor point that you absolutely cannot get out of your head, but be sure you're keeping an open mind to different perspectives. So some of this mitigation can include asking yourself, have I been disregarding information just because I deem it insignificant? How different is this from what I already originally knew? And what judgments have I made based on my initial perception? Another huge one that we see, especially in this industry, is automation bias, or the over-reliance on automated decision-making systems. Now, this can be applicable to all sorts of aspects of life, but I'm going to talk specifically about even InfoSec, OSINT, anything that uses automated tools. So as humans, we tend to take the path of least cognitive effort. It saves our brain power. There's nothing wrong with that. And while automation has proven to be useful in speeding up processes and finding new data points, definitely does not replace the need for a human element. So how does automation bias impact investigations? Well, basing our judgments strictly from automated results leads us to skewed conclusions as well as false positives, especially if an account doesn't actually belong to your target, whether it's a person or an entity, whether they share a similar username, business name, whatever it may be. Maltego is excellent, but it does come back with false positives. Still a great tool, still incredible for finding new data points, but you definitely need to be sure that you're sitting down and actually going through that and seeing what actually belongs to your target. So ask yourself, or be sure that you are always reviewing and verifying your automated results. Keep in mind, tools are excellent to supplement your thought process, but it's definitely not something to replace your overall thought process, especially not your decision making. And then question if results are actually related to your person or area of interest or entity, and then document it if you can't confirm that it is. Projection bias. This is the assumption that other people think, feel, believe, and behave like you currently do. This can also be your future self, and assuming that your current self thinks, feels, believes, and behaves exactly how your future self will. This type of bias is a self-forecasting error. We underestimate the influence of our current mental states on our own behavior, causing us to make decisions that meet instant gratification. It's a projection of future preferences, or our projection of future preferences depends on our current state. This is also known as an empathy gap. But overall, projection bias is the unconscious assumption that others share the same beliefs, thoughts, or values that you do. Failure to acknowledge this bias can not only lead to impulsive decision-making, but it can also lead to missed data points, operational security areas, or errors, skewed results, and overall being unprepared. So be sure to ask yourself, what's my current state of mind or emotion, and how is it affecting my current decision-making throughout my investigation? Am I judging this situation in a way that only suits my current needs? Or am I considering my potential future scenarios or needs that I may not currently be prepared for? And how might I prepare for those? The next one is overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias can be especially detrimental. It's when we overestimate our own abilities. Overconfidence can be influenced by behavioral factors, emotional factors, cognitive factors, and even environmental, which I don't have listed here. Inflated confidence causes us to take certain issues lightly. Some great examples include ethics, communications, and especially skill level. The higher the level of overconfidence, the higher the level of risk. And there's definitely a key difference between overconfidence and confidence. When we start embellishing our abilities or our capability to understand a certain situations, both to ourselves and others, we run a pretty heavy risk of having distorted perceptions. And when it comes to OSINT, that puts us at an even higher risk for operational security mistakes, or even ethical mistakes. Some of the worst ethical mistakes come from overconfidence. So just keep in mind, no one can know everything. And there is a ton of strength in acknowledging what you don't know, and even more strength in seeking out the opinion of somebody who may know about something that you don't currently have the right knowledge on. But just be sure that you're not revealing any details that you're not supposed to. And what I mean by that is you can seek out help in OSINT investigations, but be sure that you're not revealing who the client is, who your target is, any PII things surrounding your target and or client, and so forth. Overconfidence can pretty heavily play into the halo and reverse halo effect. Now, these effects are when perceived characteristics of a person cause us to have positive or negative bias towards their overall personality. So with the halo effect, it's when you're viewing the person as an angel. So a positive impression equals higher trust that we place in them, which leads to further positive assumptions. So if you know somebody or an entity like a company has a positive quality, you're more likely to come to the conclusion that they have other positive traits and let those overshadow any negative traits. Whereas the reverse halo effect is the exact opposite. It's also known as the horn and or devil effect. So if you know a person or entity has a negative quality, you're much more likely to come to the conclusion that they have other negative traits and allow that impression to define your overall judge of their character. So a negative impression equals lower trust, which leads to further negative assumptions. Both of these can heavily cloud our judgment in overall decision-making and our OSINT investigations. The halo effect is part of why social engineering can be so effective, especially if you're creating a positive rapport with that person. But you have to be careful to not make that person start to question those positive traits. Overconfidence bias supplements both of these because we're pretty prone to believing that would never happen to me. I would never make that call. I would know if this was a fake person. I would know if this was a bad person. So it's fairly easy to see how that can really heavily influence our decision making and other people's decision making. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into in depth on each of those biases. Hopefully by now you at least have a basic understanding of how cognitive psychology influences the way that we perceive things and how we react to those things. Remember that no one is immune to biases, and you can't force yourself to not have them. But you can be aware of them, and you can be aware of the impact that they have on your decision-making. But when we let impulse guide our decision-making, we run into much higher risks, especially when it comes to investigations and social engineering. So I am happy to answer any questions in the chat or wherever is applicable. There are some ways that you can support the Innocent Lives Foundation and learn more about what we do. As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit group that actually seek out anyone who is hiding behind anonymity online while they abuse children. But that is all for now. Thank you.